damit unser Gequatsche jetzt nicht, nicht verewigt wird. Johannes ist der Mitorganisator, der eigentlich auch die Idee hatte, sowas zu machen. Und
Hallo.
Hallo, Herr Umland. Hallo. Vielen Dank, dass Sie mitmachen.
Ja, große Ehre.
Ja, die Ehre ist ganz auf unserer Seite, Andreas.
Auf jeden Fall. Wo sitzen Sie gerade, wenn ich fragen darf?
In Jena, bei meinem Vater.
Okay. Ja, ich habe das Event nochmal beworben, auch in Viadrina-Kreisen. Also ich hoffe, da kommt noch was zusammen. Also gucken wir mal.
Also wie ich gerade schon sagte, wenn ich das, also teilweise ist das so, dass wenn die Dinge dann in den sozialen Medien stehen, dass sie, also da hatte ich schon ganz erstaunliche, dann tausende Klicks angeblich. Also das weiß man natürlich nicht, ob die Leute sich das dann auch angeschaut haben. Aber da kommen teilweise absurde Zahlen zusammen.
So, ich hatte heute ein paar Stimmprobleme, irgendwie bin ich doch erkältet. Aber ich muss ja nicht mehr viel reden jetzt.
Ja, hoffentlich nichts Ernstes. Es könnte nachher sein, dass meine kleine Nichte hier reinrennt ins Video. Aber das lockert dann auch nur die Atmosphäre auf.
Das kennt man mittlerweile.
Wir bitten darum.
Ja.
Ja, ich hatte 4 Stunden Vorlesung heute im Seminar, deswegen bin ich an der Uni. Da kann mein kleiner Junge nicht reinknallen. Das ist diesmal ausgeschlossen. Sonst tut er es gerne. Letzte Woche bei Susanne hat er es gemacht.
Ach Gott.
So, wir fangen immer so ein bisschen 2, 3 Minuten später an, damit die Leute sich noch zuschalten können.
Mhm.
Wir haben jetzt parallel heute auch noch eine andere Veranstaltung hier am Institut von den Anthropologen. Da gab es ein bisschen böses Blut, weil wir denen die Veranstaltungszeit weggenommen haben, wie es heißt.
Ja, okay.
Aber die Literaturwissenschaftler machen was um 6, also von daher in 2 Stunden. Naja, der Terminkalender ist eh voll.
Ja. Ja, das ist manchmal so. Muss man mit Fassung tragen.
Genau.
Carsten, ist das, was Daniel macht, online oder ist das in Präsenz?
Du, ich weiß es nicht.
Das ist, genau, aber 18 Uhr, so hatte ich das auch verstanden. Also eigentlich ist das ja nur leichte Überlappung dann. Gucken wir mal.
Ui, Daniel ist hier.
Ja, hallo.
So your own event takes place in Zoom as well, or? I mean, this YouTuber.
Okay. Yeah, no, it starts at 6, so that I thought I can listen to the lecture before and then go. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for organizing this.
Du siehst, Andreas, wir haben eine recht internationale Gruppe zusammen.
Okay.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I think we will just give the people 2 other minutes to join. And afterwards, I'm going to shortly introduce to you Dr. Andreas Umland, and then we will start with his presentation. Yeah, people are still joining, but maybe I start with a short introduction of our speaker today. I'm very happy to introduce to you Dr. Andreas Umland. We know each other already for quite a time, 20 years or so. Andreas Umland is an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And he's also an associate professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. So he's really someone who has experienced the last decades in Ukrainian life in his own also private life, because he was usually based in Kiev. He has a PhD in politics from Cambridge University and a PhD in history from Freie University in Berlin. He was researcher and teacher at quite a lot of institutions worldwide, at Stanford, at Harvard, in Russian universities in Yekaterinburg, and he was also teaching in German universities in Eichstätt and Jena. He's also editor of one of the most important book series for post-Soviet history, and all our previous speakers have published precisely in Andreas' book series, Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society, with the Ibidem Press in Stuttgart. In his academic works, Andreas has discussed such controversial personalities as Vladimir Zhirinovsky and Alexander Dugin. He's an expert in topics, among others, like Russian and Ukrainian domestic politics, foreign affairs, nationalism, Eurasianism, and comparative fascism. And I'm today very pleased that he has agreed to share his valuable time with us in Tallinn today. And not the least because, I mean, he's nowadays one of the most questioned, he's the most active, one of the most active commentators on Ukrainian affairs in German media. Andreas, thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carsten. As I said, it's a big honor for me to speak at Tallinn University, and also I'm delighted that after such long time we still keep contact and are now here cooperating on this panel. Yes, so the title of the lecture is announced as being about comparative and historical aspects of what we are observing now in Ukraine, this Russian invasion. And one could, of course, compare to the Russian behavior towards Ukraine and the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, if you want to use that term, in many frameworks. I will concentrate here on two comparisons that I feel most familiar with, but these are by no means the only ones, and perhaps even not even the most appropriate ones. That is, first the comparative diachronic comparison with the Weimar Republic, post-World War I Germany in the interwar period, and then also the reference that one finds nowadays more and more in with regard to Russia, and in particular Vladimir Putin, the reference to fascism. And the second comparison, the historical one, also diachronic within Ukrainian history, is or within in fact Russian imperial history, is with the within the post-Soviet period. There are good reasons, and many Ukrainians do so, to compare the Russian behavior that we currently see with Moscow's behavior during the Tsarist period or during the Soviet period. And these are also interesting and illuminating comparisons, and they are certainly for Ukrainians today rather important to see this continuity over centuries, basically, in Moscow's behavior towards Ukraine. But I don't know these periods as well. Perhaps Carsten could say more about this, being a more historian. I also did a PhD in Berlin in history, but I'm more a political scientist for my training here, and I'm more familiar with the post-Soviet period, so I'm going to concentrate on this. But perhaps first, the issue of the sort of post-imperial context that makes the current situation to some degree, I would argue, similar to the one of Germany after World War I, and the developments in post-Soviet Russia, similar to the developments in interwar Germany during the Weimar Republic, and then even to some degree similar to what happened in Germany after 1933. So what we have here in Germany and in Russia, and you probably are already familiar with this argument, is a typical post-imperial, neo-imperial situation in that the former empire is reduced as a result of a defeat in a major confrontation that was, in the German case, World War I, in the Soviet-Russian case, the Cold War, and that the territory of the former empire is reduced respectively, and that you also find then nationals of the former imperial nation, in the German case, the Germans, and in the Russian case, ethnic Russians, outside the newly emerging nation state, and that this sort of division of the nation of the former empire, the dominant nation of the former empire, then becomes a major topic in not only foreign affairs but also domestic affairs, both in interwar Germany and in post-Soviet Russia. There's also a certain similarity here in the assertion of a Sonderweg, a special path, in German political thinking and in Russian political thinking. The contents of this special path are, of course, not that similar. They have some structural similarities, but the reference points here are different. Both of these special path theories are, to be sure, anti-Western, but the Russian here is more about orthodoxy on the one hand, or a certain Eurasian assertion of a Eurasian civilization on the other, whereas in the German case, the assertion of a special path was somewhat less outlandish, in that there was no assertion of a separate civilization, but merely of a special mission and a special role of Germany in world history. I don't want to go here too much into this comparison. That's a topic of its own. I can recommend here, for instance, the publications of Leonid Lux, my former colleague at the Catholic University of Eichstätt, Ingolstadt, who is now, or who has been at least during the last years, also teaching at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, who has extensively written about these special parts of Germany and Russia. Other structural similarities one could mention here is a feeling of being sort of betrayed or not respectfully treated by the Western powers after the defeat in World War I and in the Cold War, respectively. I would say in the Russian case, this is a far more sort of made-up story than in the German case. For Germany, there is, I would think, a legitimate discussion about the treatment of Germany after World War I by the Western powers in the Versailles Treaty, and whether this was indeed a factor in the rise then of fascism and in the end then of the Weimar Republic. In the Russian case, the narrative is actually not that different from the German narrative of the interwar period, but I would say the story is much more made up, in that there is this assertion that allegedly there was a promise by the West not to extend NATO into Eastern Europe, and so the entire Russian-Western relationship was as it's now portrayed by the Russian state and not the least by Vladimir Putin, built on a broken promise, on a betrayal, on deceit, and therefore Russia is now sort of correcting this earlier sort of deceit, or is taking revenge for having been deceived in this way by the West. I can here recommend the book by Professor Zarot, Not 1 Inch, I think, if I remember that correctly, is the title of the book, which is a study of the negotiations between first the Soviet leadership and then the Russian leadership and the West in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and which shows, I would say, on what I would say doubtful arguments this current Russian narrative about a broken promise is built, and that there's actually a purposeful manipulation here at the basis of it, where statements and promises that indeed have been made to the Soviet leadership were made at a point in time in the early 1990s when not only the Soviet Union was still existent, but also the Warsaw Pact was still in place. And now the statements that Western representatives made then vis-a-vis Gorbachev and other representatives concerning Eastern Germany are now interpreted as having been allegedly promises made regarding the whole of Eastern Europe. There were some sort of ambivalent statements made in press conferences, for instance, by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, but in any way, there's no written document, there's no agreement, and there was also no explicit oral agreement back then on Eastern Europe, simply because that was not a topic then, as in the early 1990s, it was not yet clear that the Soviet Union and even the Warsaw Pact would fall apart, as they early on then soon did. One could list more similarities between Weimar Germany and today Russia, but what I want to briefly turn to here now is the more far-reaching assertion that what we are observing in Russia today is basically a fascist regime, a fascist foreign policy, and that the war sort of that is Russia conducting for the last 1.5 months is sort of proving exactly this point. And indeed, I would have to admit here that we've been discussing this among colleagues for, I would say, 2 decades already. The similarities first between Weimar Russia and Weimar Germany and post-Soviet Russia, and then the similarities between the Putinist regime and the German fascist regime. That is an old topic, and people like Alexander Motyl and others have proposed earlier to label the current Russian regime fascist. And these earlier labels, they are to a certain degree by the latest behavior of Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine, and also the justification of this behavior and the ideology that we see emerging, supplanting this behavior, is indeed more and more reminiscent of German phenomena in the 1930s. There is a growing similarity that I would admit is sort of vindicating these earlier assertions by Motyl and others that Russia is fascist. But I would still argue that this classification of Putin and his regime as fascist is not absolutely necessary. I can understand it emotionally. Fascism is simply sort of a well-known word. The reference point is well known. Nazi Germany is one of the most well-researched and also most well in media and in education, most well-represented dictatorships in world history. And therefore, the reference here to German fascism, also partly to Italian fascism, which I think makes slightly more sense, is understandable. But the crucial difference that I would still see here between what Putin is currently trying to accomplish in Europe and partly also beyond, and with what Mussolini and Hitler tried to do in World War II, is that the agenda of fascism in general and of Mussolini and Hitler in particular is essentially revolutionary. It's trying to create a new world, a new Italy, a new Germany, and also a new international order, a new empires of new extension, of a new nature, and that what they have been trying to do is not to preserve or restore Germany, or they have not been reacting, they have not been reactionaries, but they have been trying to build a new world, a new Germany and Italy dominated world that was referencing, of course, for instance, to the Roman Empire, to certain pagan Germanic traditions, if you like, but that were essentially revolutionary projects. I don't see such a project in Putin's case. He remains reactionary, an ultra-conservative, if you like, a restorationist. He wants to restore the Tsarist and Soviet Empire to as much as to a degree as much as possible. One could speculate that if Hitler had not come to power in the 1930s, but basically the kind of political camp that Paul von Hindenburg was representing, the old imperial Germany, if that part of the German political spectrum would have remained in power, we might have also seen perhaps not another world war, but new wars in Europe coming out of Germany in order to restore Germany. That is, of course, a speculation, but there was, as you probably know, a certain similarity or closeness between conservative German ultranationalism and imperialism and revolutionary German ultranationalism and imperialism, namely Nazism, and that in some ways one could argue that Putin is perhaps similar in certain ways to Paul von Hindenburg in terms of his past, how he came to power, what was his sort of career in the Ancien regime, and what his program is. In that way, I think the fascist term is, I would say, still misleading for the Putinist regime. I cannot exclude fully that Russia could, in a worst-case scenario, turn actually fascist. There are fascists in Russia. One of them has just died. I think Zhirinovsky actually was a fascist. He was often perceived as a clown, but he developed in the 1990s a plan for a so-called last dash to the south that amounted to a fascist revolution, imperial revolution. Namely, he wanted to secure a rebirth or a new birth of Russia by way of including into the Russian Empire Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iran. That means countries that have never been part of the Tsarist or Soviet Empire, but he thought that this would be necessary for Russia to be secure, happy, and calm. Calmness was one of his main terms in his classical book, The Last Dash to the South. Zhirinovsky has now just died, but there are other fascists in Russia like Alexander Dugin who have these sort of revolutionary imperialist ideas. So I think that is, of course, to a certain degree, a purely theoretical distinction I'm making here, but it does have also some policy implications in that the Russian regime, I think, is still behaving the way it does because it is calculating its steps. It's sort of narrating its program as a restoration of a lost Russia. It is not a fanatic regime to the degree that that Mussolini's and Hitler's regimes were fanatic and then even suicidal, one could argue. Some have argued that Putin's behavior here has been suicidal recently too, because he is sort of destroying Russia with this attack on Ukraine. But as I'm going to just argue in the second part of my presentation, Putin's behavior, Russia's behavior over the last 1.5 months follows actually a pattern which may have suggested to Putin and his entourage that he could get away with it and that it would not lead to the sort of disastrous sanctions that that Russia is now facing. And that leads me to the second part of my presentation, to the historical diachronic comparison with Russia's behavior in the last 30 years. And as I mentioned, that is not the only historical reference point. One could also compare Russia's current behavior to Soviet behavior and to the behavior of the Tsarist Empire. But I know this post-Soviet period better than others, and they therefore will only make the comparison here. And as I just indicated, I think if the current Russian leadership is looking at its behavior during the last 30 years, it is seeing perhaps much less discontinuity than we in the West are recognizing in Moscow's behavior during the last weeks. If you take, for instance, one of the justifications that Putin has proposed for his attack on Ukraine, that is actually a very similar story to the one that Alexander Lebed has been telling his listeners in 1992 when he justified the mingling or the intervention of the 14th Russian Army in Transnistria into an inner Moldovan conflict. So if you watch the crucial press conference that Lebed, the commander of the 14th Russian Army stationed in Moldova in 1992, if you watch this press conference, which is freely available on YouTube, it's actually striking how similar the justification is, namely that Lebed says that the 14th Russian Army basically had no other choice than to get involved into the inner Moldovan conflict because the new leadership in Chisinau, in the capital of Moldova, is worse than the SS, the German SS, and therefore, of course, a Russian army would have to intervene here and to save the Russian speakers in Transnistria from genocide. So that is one of the features here. Also, what we had already in the early 1990s were Russian troops stationed outside Russia against the will of the governments of the newly emerged countries in the Caucasus and in Moldova. A peculiarity here of the Transnistrian Moldovan Republic was that this has, to my knowledge, never been recognized, this so-called republic, by Russia itself, unlike Abkhazia and so-called South Ossetia, and then recently the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Transnistrian Moldovan Republic has, to my knowledge, never been recognized, but still Russia kept an unwanted, by the Moldovan government, unwanted contingent, basically the remnants of the 14th Russian Army in Transnistria station, not a large unit, between 1,000 and 2,000 men, largely recruited from the local population, but recruited for the Russian army, for a unit of the Russian army. And the sad thing about the Moldovan story is that Russia's behavior in Moldova was never sanctioned. There was never any serious attempt to actually force Russia into stopping its support for the Transnistrian Moldovan so-called Republic, this pseudo-state not even recognized by Russia. There was never a serious punishment for Russia just leaving its troops stationed in Moldova against the wish of the Moldovan government. And that all early on set the pattern for the following Russian behavior vis-a-vis Georgia and vis-a-vis Ukraine. A particularly interesting aspect of the Moldovan story is, moreover, that in 1994, Moldova and Russia concluded a treaty about the withdrawal of Russian troops from Moldova. And the interesting point is here not only that Russia never fulfilled this treaty and never withdrew its troops according to this treaty, but also that Moldova in 1994 adopted a new constitution. And in Article 11 of this new constitution, Moldova declared itself a bloc-free country and thereby excluded an accession to NATO. And that is, of course, the NATO aspirations of Georgia was, of course, a major justification in 2008, and then a major justification in 2014, and now again a major justification for the interventions of Russia in Georgia, in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, and now all over Ukraine in 2022. But Moldova has partly suffered a similar fate as Georgia and Ukraine, without having actually these NATO aspirations, only having similar having aspirations to join the European Union. And here the three countries are indeed similar, and as you may know, they have now formed the so-called association treaty and are trying to basically enter the European Union jointly. But I think the Moldovan story is here really sort of crucial. It is, I would call it, the original sin of Western policies, basically setting the pattern long before Putin came to power, long before the Russian-Georgian War of 2008 and the annexation of Crimea and the pseudo-civil war in eastern Ukraine in 2014. And so if you see it in this tradition, I think many in Moscow may now be actually surprised why the West has as perhaps some Russian leaders see it, aggressively reacted to Russia's attack on Ukraine against the background of an absence of Western reaction to the Russian intervention in Moldova in 1992, and also to the very muted reaction of the West to Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, and of the recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. Also in 2014, one could argue there was some reaction, of course, to the annexation of Crimea and also to the events in eastern Ukraine, but these sanctions were minor. There were individual sanctions, and moreover, the sanctions, the sectoral sanctions that were then in late July 2014 adopted by the European Union had, I would say, a rather ambivalent meaning and sent an ambivalent signal to Moscow. These sectoral sanctions that were imposed by the European Union in late July 2014 are today celebrated, or have ever since been celebrated as a show of unity and as a proof for the principledness and the sort of normative drive of EU foreign policy. But if you look at the exact sequence and typology of sanctions in spring, summer 2014, the picture is much more ambivalent. So you have on 16th of July 2014, the imposition, the last sanctions round before the imposition of sectoral sanctions which were on 16th of July still individual sanctions imposed in connection with the annexation of Crimea and the pseudo-civil war in eastern Ukraine. Then you have on 17th of July, as you may remember, the shooting down of the MH17 Malaysian airliner, and with more than 200 EU citizens on board, most of them Dutch citizens. And then you have 12 days later, after this, on 29th of July, suddenly a new type of sanctions imposed on Russia, namely sectoral sanctions, financial sanctions, and for certain key technologies for Russia. Not very harsh sanctions, basically leaving most of the economic interaction between the EU and Russia intact, but certain technologies and certain financial instruments were sanctions. And the odd thing about these, the sanction rounds on 29th of July 2014, which was, one could argue, the major sanction round in this entire story of the sanctions, was that they were imposed at a moment when it looked for a while, for a couple of weeks, at least to me, then I was then living in Ukraine, as if Ukraine was winning. So the sanctions were imposed at a moment when it looked as if Ukraine would take control again of eastern, the Ukrainian government would take control again of eastern Ukraine, and it would actually win the war against the Russia-supported separatists. And so these were actually odd sanctions, and the signal that I fear that the West was then sending to Moscow was that we are not very interested in what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. What we are interested in is that you leave EU citizens unharmed, and that was a punishment not related actually to the course of the war in eastern Ukraine, but it was a punishment related to the death of over 200 EU citizens in the Malaysian airliner. And so the message that the Kremlin may have gotten out of this was that, well, we can do whatever we want in Ukraine. The sanctions are basically unrelated to it, because these sanctions, sectoral sanctions, were imposed on us when we were actually losing and not in the offensive. What we shouldn't do, however, when we invade post-Soviet countries, we should never kill EU citizens. That is really bad, because then the real sanctions will come. And that's why I think now perhaps the Russian leadership is somewhat perplexed by the harshness of the already imposed sanctions and the discussion about a full energy embargo that we have. At least in Germany, that is an active discussion with I would think, open outcome. And so the historical record here was actually supportive, you could argue in a certain way, of the Russian behavior in the last weeks, and that the Russians may have expected the reaction of the West to be much more muted, to be temporal, to be as ambivalent as it was concerning Moldova, Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, and the pseudo-civil war in eastern Ukraine. So I think that is also a crucial historical context to understand why we got into this escalation. I think a major factor here was that Russia was never before seriously and unambiguously punished for its actions against the sovereignty of post-Soviet republics, and now it's actually the first time that there is an unambiguous, really punishment of Russia for its behavior in a post-Soviet republic, a harsh punishment already now, which the Russians not yet feel fully, or the ordinary Russians do not yet perhaps understood fully, but which is probably going to hit the Russian economy quite substantively, and may actually mean the end of Russia as a sort of at least half great power in world politics. Let me maybe finish on that and then switch to the Q&A now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andreas, for not only introducing very interesting and challenging historical comparison, but also for going a bit deeper into this historical continuity of the behavior of Russian governments in the last 30 years. I would open the floor now for questions. You may raise your hand virtually here with these gimmicks you have in Zoom, or you may also type your questions into the chat. Johannes.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. Very interesting. I have one very short question, actually, or two very short questions. Like the first one is, like your argument was, okay, like after '92, Russia actually got the signal from the West, whatever we can just do as we please, because there won't be any strong reactions, right? Like my first question would be, as to this Transnistrian case, why did Russia not officially recognize this self-proclaimed Transnistrian republic? I mean, it's been sustaining this republic for 30 years by now, so what's the point in not recognizing it? I mean, now when it did recognize these two self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, surely before the war, it was a pretext to send troops there, right? But so what's the point in Transnistria? And the second point would be actually like what you said about the original sin of Western polities, like not reacting to what Russia did in 1992. What actually was the reaction, or could you describe what it was? Like, how did people categorize this? Was it just oh well, yeah, there's some trouble in the post-Soviet sphere, but actually it's nothing that really harms us. Or what was it? Could you maybe comment on this? Thank you.
Yeah, eventually I can only speculate what is sort of behind the Russian decision, first of the Yeltsin administration, then of the Putin administration, to have not recognized the Transnistrian Republic, although it is subsidized, especially by Gazprom, heavily, and Russia is now, I think one of the reasons is actually the subsidy, in that Russia proceeds from the assumption that the Moldovan government has to return to Russia or to Gazprom the enormous debt of, I think now $7 billion, something, or even more, for the gas that Transnistria has consumed over the last 30 years. And if Russia would recognize Transnistria, then there would be even less chance to get any of this back. I don't think they will get it back, but perhaps that was one of the factors. Also, one of the factors here, I guess, was that the leadership of Moldova was, of course, very or the leaderships of Moldova were very different. We had communist leadership. In 2002, we had this very odd development that the Tashkent Pact was transformed in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, if I remember that correctly, in Chisinau, although Moldova did not become a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So there may have been always the assumption, or the hope at least, in Moscow, that Moscow would not just get Transnistria, but the whole of Moldova back into its sphere of influence. And that for that, perhaps a recognition then of Transnistria would have been a problem. So, but these are just speculations. I also have to admit that I'm not that much of an expert on Moldova. I'm more looking here on the parallels to the behavior of Moscow towards Moldova, and also about the Western arguments here, for instance, with the NATO aspiration as a allegedly sufficient explanation for Russia's behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine. But if you look at it, Moldova never or has actually in its constitution excluded a NATO membership, but wasn't treated much differently from Georgia and from Ukraine. And also about the Donetsk and Luhansk so-called republics, they were also first not recognized. And, of course, the leaders of these republics, so-called republics, they were unhappy about that. And they were only recently where these so-called republics recognized. For me, the question is rather, why did they wait for such a long time? Again, my suspicion is here that they wanted actually the whole of Ukraine and not just these republics. So they may now settle for these republics, so-called republics, perhaps extended to the territories of the entire Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, if they manage to conquer them. But initially, the plan was perhaps like with Moldova to get the whole of the country. Whereas in Georgia, they may have never had these sort of illusions that if you look at the public opinion in Georgia, that is much more clear, much more pro-Western already for a very long time, pro-NATO, anti-Russian. So in Georgia, they never had these sort of hopes that they could include Georgia, the whole of Georgia again, into the sphere of influence, or at least they did not see it as an immediate possibility, and therefore they perhaps decided then to recognize these countries, these republics in 2008. And the other question, what was the?
It was just about the reaction of the Western.
The Western reaction. I think that was sort of the situation in 1992 was that we had lots of wars then, of course, in Yugoslavia, in the Southern Caucasus, in Georgia, in Karabakh, and also in Central Asia. And so, there was perhaps not enough differentiation. This was just seen as a sort of the general instability in the post-communist sphere. And the special problem here of the regular Russian army officially playing a key role in the establishment of this pseudo republic and in deciding the inner Moldovan conflict was sort of perhaps lost in this just sort of general. I have to admit, I mean, I was a student back then, but to me, I didn't then recognize that there was something fishy or that was slightly different from the Karabakh War or from what happened in Yugoslavia, in that here the Russian army was directly involved and officially involved, and also this justification with the Moldovan leadership being allegedly worse than the SS. So that is, of course, also then a rhetoric that we've seen many times with regard to the Baltic countries. In a way, you could argue that all these wars under Putin, they started, in fact, with the cyber attack on Estonia in 2007. That was the first, and then comes 2008, and so also it coincided, of course, with the Munich speech of Putin and his sort of official turn, anti-Western turn.
Yeah, more questions. I mean, I would really like to a bit challenge your historical parallels that you draw between post-Soviet Russia on the one hand and Germany after the First World War, and starting exactly with Transnistria and Lebed. Is there anything that happened during the Weimar Republic that would already give Hitler later on a kind of reason to think of foreign policy in these terms of continuity, right? Is there anything?
Nothing comes to my mind now. Perhaps one would have to. I mean, there was a lot of colonialism, imperialism in the Weimar Republic. I mean, Konrad Adenauer was a colonialist at that time, So, but yeah, I would have to go back and look at whether one could find a sort of some sort of structurally equivalent event in, perhaps, I don't know, with the war. I don't know, but I haven't checked that. I mean, the comparison is, of course, only on a very high level of abstraction. It's of course.
I mean, it's very interesting to follow these arguments. This is just what I did when you were presenting it.
Yeah.
We have another question, Rachel.
Yeah, no, I just wondered, when you were saying that you like thought that Putin was resembling Hindenburg and sort of comparative figures like that rather than like say Hitler. I just wondered like what can you go like into like a little bit of like what did Hindenburg do that makes him like Putin? Like what like why is it similar? Because I'm not very good at like sort of First World War history. I just wondered if you could go into like a bit of detail as to what his regime was like that makes him like Putin.
Again, as I just said to Carsten, these comparisons, they are on a very high level of abstraction. You know,
Yeah.
this is on a purely structural sort of.
Yeah.
Putin is a representative of the old regime. I mean, he was a much less prominent member of the old regime than Hindenburg was of the Kaiser regime. You know, he was a hero of World War I and so on. Putin was part of the regime, but he was a low-level officer in the KGB. But his sort of stylization then as this sort of as a spy, and you know, there's a lot of speculation how much this sort of mythology around the cinema figure of Stirlitz in 17 Moments of Spring, which was a very popular movie about a Soviet spy in the Nazi leadership during the last weeks of the Nazi regime. And you know how much this sort of reference point was then sort of transferred to Putin. Also, Hitler was not a representative of the old regime. He was, you know, a newcomer. In a way, he was perhaps more similar to Zhirinovsky or to Dugin, who comes out of nowhere basically. And then builds up a new party and comes up with a new ideology. So then, you know, Putin wins the elections after this sort of disillusionment with democracy in the 1990s in Germany. Hindenburg wins the elections then twice. After the disillusionment of Germans with Weimar democracy, and both Putin and Hindenburg then use their presidential powers to reduce the power of the parliament and create presidential regimes. This is also, you know, not equivalent to each other, because there was still this sort of party system, a relatively free party system in the late Weimar Republic under Hindenburg's presidential regime, which is not any longer existent in Russia today. You have other parties, but the party system is highly manipulated by the Kremlin. So the comparisons are very sort of is very partial, and but the basic aims of both of them, I think, were similar in that Hindenburg wanted some sort of restoration of the old empire, and Putin wants some sort of restoration of the old empire, you know, and that is the sort of restorationist imperialism. And as I speculated, you know, if one could have imagined that the political camp that Hindenburg was representing, basically the ultra-conservatives of Germany, would have stayed in power, maybe we would have also had more war in Europe. Maybe not a second world war, but I could imagine that there would have been irredentist wars, you know, for the Sudetenland, for, you know, Western Polish territories, for East French territories. So one could imagine some sort of, you know, irredentist wars, also with a non-fascist, imperialist, ultra-conservative German regime, but that is of course a speculation. We don't know what would have happened if Hitler hadn't come to power.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ksenia?
Yes, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. It's interesting to see the perspective, like from the West to these questions, because, I have a comment and a question. And the comment, because I hesitated whether I should make it, but you mentioned his name not once but twice, so I think I am obliged to do that. I think we really shouldn't make Dugin into what he is not. Like he's not some kind of Rasputin in this system. I really think that the West highly overreacts to like imagines like his influence. Yeah, that's just something I needed to put out there with this. But my actual question is, in terms of historical parallels, what do you think about the one with the Second Empire of France, of this kind of populist imperial ambition? Because I recently saw it brought up, and I remember that my leftist friends made it back in 2013, but back then no one listened to them, obviously. But now it seems to make even more sense. Like, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm not a big expert on France, so I would just refer you to a brilliant book by Stephen Hansen, Post-Imperial Democracies, where he compares post-Soviet Russia with Weimar Germany and with France, with Bonapartist France. And so, there's this book, and but I don't read French. I don't even read French, so I wouldn't want to comment on this. But this comparison has been made, and perhaps it's actually a much better comparison than with Hitler. And also, there have been people who have suggested that one could compare Putin to General Franco, whom the sort of more theoretically minded students of fascism don't regard as a fascist. He had his regime had a sort of fascist component early on, the Falange party, but in general, the regime was not a revolutionary regime, was a conservative regime. So there are these other comparisons. As I said, I mean, the comparison with the Weimar Republic is perhaps not the best one. One could imagine many other sort of situations with which to compare it, and France is probably also the one that comes here to my mind. Well, about Dugin, I've written an entire dissertation about Dugin, and I've dealt with this issue of his influence. Certainly, he is not. I don't know him having ever met Putin. As far as I know, he has never met Putin. But he, it's very difficult to measure the sort of indirect influence that people like him have. As you probably know, he has an enormous production of texts. A friend of mine who has also studied him, Vyacheslav Likhachov, who lives now in Kyiv, actually has said that Dugin writes quicker than he reads. He has like books out every year. He produces videos, he produces lectures and articles, and hundreds of thousands of words probably that he has printed or uttered somewhere. And then you wonder, and there must be some market for it. Some people must be reading it, and some people must be watching these videos. And also, if you now, read the Osnovy Geopolitiki, the foundations of geopolitics, which I would say is I would classify it's this sort of seminal Russian fascist post-Soviet text. This book, it's a quite thick book with lots of reference to the German conservative revolution and so on. And if you look what Dugin writes there on Ukraine, it's basically what Putin is now saying about Ukraine, or what this Sergei Trofimtsev has written on RIA Novosti about Ukraine. That is basically now this sort of Duginist ideology, at least with regard to Ukraine, of the 1990s, has now become Russia's state policy. And that might be a coincidence. There may be no direct connection between it, but the congruence of this coincidence is high. You know, it's worryingly high. And there's also, you know, Dugin had this international council of the Eurasian movement, and then he had, you know, sort of ministers there. He's in contact apparently with Sergei Glaziev. There's this Malofeyev, and so on. And so he's part of this sort of circle that does have a certain influence on Russian policies. For instance, we have these Glaziev tapes. We know that Glaziev was actually directly himself involved in the sort of attempted split of Ukraine in 2014. We have the telephone conversations of Glaziev, and Glaziev is already quite close to Dugin within the Izborsky Klub and so on. So it's difficult to say. You know, it's certainly there's no direct influence, and in a way you could argue that these former KGB guys, they don't need Dugin really for, you know, formulating their aggressive ideologies. They have their own sources, they have their own traditions, they have their own, and there was actually a period when Dugin was actually arguing that the KGB is Atlanticist and is sort of anti-Russian. But, you know, I mean, but still, you know, he's a player on this sort of intellectual market. He's not very intellectual. I mean, I don't think he's very interesting intellectually, but at least he's enormously productive, and there seems to be some market for that. And he is one of the several sort of contributors to this shift of the Russian public, especially first of the Russian elite towards anti-Americanism, and only later of the common Russians to anti-Americanism. If you look at the sort of opinion polling data for anti-Americanism, then the elite actually turns anti-American before the larger population. And I think Dugin was part of this, among others, among Prokhanov and Kurginyan and Baburin and lots of other these ideologists of anti-Americanism, imperialism, ultranationalism. He's only one of them, but you know, I think he's not trivial, and he's I think the only one actually in Russia who has influence outside Russia. That makes him also interesting. He's read outside, and he's, you know, even respected by the far right outside Russia. They think of him as, you know, being somebody important theoretically, intellectually. I don't think he is really. I mean, if you read his stuff, and if you've read the, you know, Conservative Revolution before, it's basically, you know, it's all a replay of Schmidt and Heidegger and Spengler and Jünger and these people. It's actually not very interesting if you know the international far right to read Dugin. But he is sort of reproducing this, and many in the West find him interesting for one reason or another.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? I would like to take our debate today back to Ukraine, right? I mean, in front of us is Andreas Umland, who has spent the last decade or even more in Kiev. And if I just remember what Susanne Worschech has told us last week about the birth of civil society, at least from 2014 onwards, I would like to ask you, Andreas, how do you assess this development that was quite astonishing, I think, for quite a lot of observers who didn't really go into the details of local Ukrainian development, that you have so many grassroots ideas and grassroots initiatives that changed in a way the face of Ukraine dramatically, and which ultimately leads us to the situation we have nowadays when the Russians face a completely unified population in Ukraine. What is your take of it?
I have to admit, I don't have a good explanation for that, because if you look again in the sort of comparative contemporary history of Ukraine, this should not have happened. So unlike the Baltic countries, Ukraine has experienced the worst phase of Soviet history, the 1930s, high Stalinism, the Holodomor, the purges, you know, a systematic destruction of both the Ukrainian peasantry and of the Ukrainian intelligentsia, and a sort of flattening of Ukrainian pre-revolutionary tradition to a degree, you know, that you would expect that there should have been nothing left, you know. But you know, contrary to, you know, what you would expect, you have actually then already in the 1990s a civil society emerging, you know, partly that is of course also a result of the activities of the Ukrainian diaspora in Ukraine, somewhat similar to what happened to the Baltic countries. But still, it's surprising actually how well it organized itself during the Orange Revolution, during the Euromaidan Revolution. And here what we're now observing is basically also, you know, just a replay of what we know already from history, that not only do states make war, but also wars make states, you know, that this war is now actually sort of leading to a consolidation of the Ukrainian nation that is indeed, again, very impressive. And what I, you know, feel from what I get, the feeling that I get from not being currently in Ukraine, but what I get from the when I speak to people in Ukraine, is that there is a enormous, you know, solidarity, enormous sort of cooperation, improvisation, collective action in Ukraine that makes Ukraine now such a hard, you know, such a hard case for Putin, because the population and the state are and the civil society are united in all of this. Yeah, you know, it may have to do with longer traditions, you know, the Cossack tradition. Then there is a peculiar West Ukrainian tradition that I don't want to go, which is somewhat more ambivalent. I don't want to go now into. Eventually, I don't have a full good answer for that. Why Ukraine is so much different from Russia and Belarus? Although, you know, until 2020, you could always, there was always this very sort of convenient comparison of Belarus and Ukraine. And then in 2020, it turned out actually that Belarus is not that different from Ukraine. You know, that civil society there is not that flattened. So actually, what after the protests started in Belarus, I'm also less curious about or less flabbergasted by the Ukrainian phenomenon, because, you know, apparently this potential was there also in Belarus. It just came out later than in Ukraine, and so Ukraine is not as peculiar anymore. And now we're hoping, of course, that maybe there's also some hidden potential that we have not yet noticed in Russia that will come out and also then trigger something similar in Russia. But yeah, so I have no good answer to this question, essentially, in spite of having lived 17 years now in Ukraine.
Okay, Johannes.
Yeah, this question might lead far into speculation, so sorry for this, but you being a political analyst, I can't help but ask that question. Like, do you think that Ukraine is the last victim in Russia's neo-imperial project, or do you think there is a high danger that the former Western parts of the Tsars and the Soviet Empire, so the Baltics, for example, will also be attacked at some point? And the second question would be, actually, how do you explain this high rate of approval that Putin's policies enjoy in Russia at the very moment? So I think the latest poll was 83% or something, so extremely high. Is it just the propaganda, or is there like conviction behind that? What do you say? And sorry, I actually have a third question, but this goes back to Dugin. I mean, I've watched his videos, like scholarly interest on YouTube. He's also multilingual, right? Like he's speaking Italian, German, French, all kinds of languages. And it's an interesting figure. I would also say like a strange figure, of course. And you mentioned the European far right, which has composed of like a whole network also around Dugin. Dugin is one player in this network. Do you know anything about how this network looks like at the very moment and how they react to the war in Ukraine and what Dugin says? I haven't followed this, so maybe by accident. Thank you. Sorry, a lot of questions. So.
Okay, what was the first one again? I've already forgotten.
Me too. I think the first one was about, let me check. Whether Ukraine is the last object or target.
And then the support and then Dugin. Yeah. Contrary to what most people think, most analysts in my perception think, I believe that countries like Estonia are actually safe. And that what we, at least in the past, have observed is a rather clear distinction in Russian foreign policies between NATO territory and non-NATO territory. And in engagement, military engagement, where, for instance, take 2015, Turkey, a NATO member country, shoots down a Russian airplane over Syria. Normally, according to Russian political thinking or military thinking, as far as I understand it, Russia should have at least shot down a Turkish plane in response to that. In fact, actually, what I suspect is actually would be the normal Russian reply to something like that is destroying an entire airport in the country that has shot down a Russian airplane. But nothing like that happened. There were some economic sanctions. The import of Turkish tomatoes was stopped. Tourism was hindered. Russian tourism for a while to Turkey, and then Erdogan and Putin met again, and then was fine again. And and I think the reason here is that the Russians were afraid of an escalation, and then of NATO being drawn into. They may not have been afraid of an escalation with Turkey. But because Turkey is a NATO member, they understood that this is a risky path they would get on. Or in 2008, when the US decided to send a destroyer a ship to Georgia, the Russian-Georgian War was over. Yeah. So, you wonder how Narva has been so safe over the last 30 years, since 2004. As far as I understand, Narva is the most Russian city outside Russia. It's even more Russian than Sevastopol. So, but Narva is safe, and it's like 140 kilometers away from Putin's birthplace, and a Russian city that is safe. Or take the Second Karabakh War. I think the Armenians were really upset with the Russians that Russia did not help the Armenians in this war. Why did they not help? Because Azerbaijan had an official mutual aid agreement, still has an official mutual aid agreement again with Turkey, a ratified military alliance with Turkey. Turkey was engaged in this war, not directly, but with advisors and with military technology, and Russia perhaps did not want to get into a war that could have then escalated into a Russian-Turkish war and then could have escalated into a Russia-NATO war. So that is actually, these sort of episodes illustrate to me that Russia will avoid a confrontation with NATO. And so the next targets on Russia's sort of plate could be Georgia and Moldova. I think these are the two countries that are most threatened. But as long as Ukraine is not finished, and I don't think Ukraine will be finished, so I think even Georgia and Moldova are actually comparatively safe. because Ukraine will not, they will fight it to the end, So I think even these countries can feel relatively safe as long as Ukraine is holding out. If Ukraine should fall, which is also cannot be excluded, for instance, if Russia uses weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine and then either triggers a capitulation or actually physically destroys much of Ukraine, then Georgia and Moldova would be also in danger. But as long as this sort of apocalyptic scenario does not happen, these countries are safe. Yeah, the support for Putin is very discouraging. It's actually a replication of what we've seen already during the Russian-Georgian war or during the annexation of Crimea. These actions had high support. I think this support is actually one of the reasons why Putin is doing it, because he knows this will will stabilize his power, his regime, and that is the sad story. I wonder, though, how much this will uphold once the effect of the sanctions really kick in. When people will be actually feeling that life is getting worse by the week, and there will be unemployment and higher prices and services disappearing and so on. So once they understand that the price or how high the price will be, then this may change. But indeed, it's quite frustrating. And then the third one about Dugin was
Dugin at the far right in Europe.
I haven't followed
reactions.
Yeah, I haven't followed this. I mean, oddly now, a part of the far right in the West has actually turned against Russia. So people like Marine Le Pen and Matteo Salvini, who used to be very friendly with Putin, they have now made a turnaround. The German far right is still sort of semi-supportive of Russia and is sort of repeating this sort of Russian narrative on this, also popular in the West, that the West is allegedly guilty of all of this. But even the German far right, you can feel it is sort of becoming ambivalent, because the pictures are just too devastating from Ukraine. And so yeah, I mean, Dugin is, I haven't followed him during the last weeks, but I would imagine that he is very much in favor of all of it. And he has been, as I said, I mean, there is a certain congruence of his rhetoric since the 1990s about Ukraine, not being a real country, that Russia really needs the Black Sea coast, Novorossiya. This is something that you can find already in the Fundamentals of Geopolitics, Osnowy Geopolitiki of 1997. So, and then there was the scandal in 2014, kill Ukrainians, when he was kicked out of the Moscow State University. He was a sort of a professor there, and then he said we should kill Ukrainians. But now that is now already very similar to this article of Trofimtsev on RIA Novosti, where this is already the sort of Duginist ideas are now becoming mainstream. But I assume he is very much in favor of all of this. This is basically his dream scenario that is now coming true.
Yeah, thank you again. Are there any more questions or comments on Andreas' talk? If not, then thank you again very much, Andreas. It was really exciting to listen to your experience in all things Russian, Ukrainian. I mean, you're really very, how to put it now, the way how you explain it is really easy to follow, and this is really very nice. So thank you, everyone. We will have a next meeting next week on, it's going to be Anna Werschig, right, Johannes?
Yes, exactly. Like Anna Werschig is going to talk about the language issues in Ukraine. I don't remember the title, but we're going to announce it in time. So
Yeah, and we are going to work in the direction that all the presentations are going to be uploaded. They are not yet uploaded as far as I know, but I hope that it's going to be a question just of a few days. Thank you very much again. Thank you, Andreas, and have a nice evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. It was an honor. Thanks.
Dasselbe gilt auch für uns, Andreas.
Ja.
Vielen Dank, dass du so spontan mitgemacht hast.
Ja, sehr gerne. Ja.
Klasse.
Ich bin auch gespannt. Ich werde mir die anderen auch ansehen, die anderen